Good afternoon and welcome to today's work session, this September 24th, 2024. Today our presentation will be to receive findings and recommendations from the countywide disparity study, and that will be kicked off by our Procurement Director, Roger Ball.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman, Commissioners, and County Manager. Today, the Procurement Services Department and the team from Griffin & Strong, PC, bring you the findings and recommendations from the countywide disparity study. In 2021, the Procurement Services Department created the first ever supplier diversity program at Cobb County. The goal of the program is to strengthen and improve outreach to our diverse supplier community, ensuring our supply chain is competitive and mirrors the vibrant diversity of our community. After launching the supplier diversity program, it was determined that a countywide disparity study was needed to assess the participation of diverse suppliers in the county's procurement process, determine the effectiveness of the supplier diversity program itself, and recommend modifications and adjustments, if necessary, that are in compliance with the law. In July of 2022, the Board of Commissioners approved the FY23 budget, which included a line item for the disparity study. After a thorough and competitive procurement selection process, the board approved the contract with Griffin & Strong PC to conduct the study. And for the past year, we have been all hard at work to bring you the final report that you will see today. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Ms. Michelle Jenkins, who's Director of Methodology and Research for Griffin & Strong. She will introduce the Griffin & Strong team, and then we will commence with the presentation.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to present. Again, my name's Michelle Clark Jenkins, Director of Methodology and Research for Griffin & Strong. With me today is Dr. Vincent Egan, who's our Principal Investigator, and Trinity Williams, who is our Project Manager. Joining us soon will be our CEO, Rodney K. Strong, as well. Again, I'd like to thank you. We've had a very interesting year working with your team. It's been a pleasure, and so we'll get started with our findings and recommendations. Again, we are Griffin & Strong PC. We're a law and public policy consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. We have been doing this work for 35 years. Our consulting division only does disparity research. And we specialize in also procurement reform, in developing remedial programs. We do consulting and contract compliance. Our team has 7 attorneys. We have 2 PhDs in economics, a PhD in social psychology, and a PhD in anthropology, and all of them have rolled up their sleeves over the past year to bring you this study. And no study that we've ever conducted has been challenged or overturned in court, which is important with these kinds of studies. And Trinity, you want to talk about our agenda?
Good afternoon. All right, so again, thank you for having us. We will be discussing the technical approach, going through the study parameters, and then we'll hit on the findings for each of the sections, and then we'll have overall findings, commendations, recommendations, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. All right, so here's our technical approach. We started the study off with a legal analysis, where here we were looking at the relevant case law within the county. We also conducted a policy review. We did a deep dive into policy purchasing and procedures of the county. We also conducted policy interviews as well, just to understand how the staff understood the policies and procedures themselves. We collected and cleaned data. We also conducted a relevant market analysis, and we'll walk you through that. We did utilization, availability, and disparity. Disparity analysis is where we compare the utilization of firms with the availability of firms. And again, we'll walk through those data tables there. We conducted a private sector analysis as well as the anecdotal collection. And then we are putting together the final report with recommendations. So here are our study parameters. So within this time period, the study period, October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2022, this is where the study parameters were for the data. So this was fiscal year 2018 to 2022. And then these are the industry categories where we broke down the data. It included construction, engineering, professional services and consultants, other services, and goods. And then I will pass it on to Michelle to discuss relevant market.
Thank you, Trinity. So in the beginning of our statistical analysis, the first thing we have to do is determine where are the firms located that we're going to be studying as part of this disparity study. So we take that, we borrow a little bit from antitrust law in terms of determining where your economic marketplace is. So where are you already doing business? So we took that payment data that we drew from you over a 5-year period. We looked at every payment you made to a vendor over a 5-year period. And so we looked at where those firms were located, and again, borrowing from antitrust law, which kind of says your economic marketplace is where you're doing at least 75% of your business. So we started with Cobb County and then kind of pulled out until we got to 75% in each one of those industry categories that Trinity mentioned. And so from that, we determined that your relevant geographic market area is Cobb County, Gwinnett County, and Fulton County. And that's actually pretty good news, because that means that you are spending the lion's share of your dollars with firms located fairly locally, just within those 3 counties. So in construction, within those 3 counties, 78.04% of your dollars were spent. In engineering, 95.42%. In professional services and consultants, 77.35%. In other services, 76.61%. In goods, 52.82%, which is not unusual because people buy goods from everywhere. So a lot of times we'll see that stretches out into the whole U.S. But in total, it was 73.03. And the reason we went a little under the 75 is when you go outside of those 3 counties, the numbers really drop down to being a little less significant. So from here on, all of our study, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, we do have a question.
Sorry, I was tracking, but I thought the 75%, or that the 75% included the 3 counties, the Fulton, Gwinnett, and Cobb. But we're saying in Cobb County, we're saying these numbers are only for those 3, not the Cobb County companies itself.
Right. In the study itself, you'll see the actual figures for Cobb County alone.
Okay.
So we kind of start with Cobb County and then
Perfect.
we expand out. But this is your
Back-
relevant market.
Back on track, thank you.
Okay. So from this point forward, all of our analysis is only of firms within that relevant market. So if a firm's in California, even if you utilize them, they were not part of our analysis, partially because you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples so that utilization is compared to availability within the same geographic location. So our availability analysis, this is probably the most controversial parts of a disparity study, which is who are the ready, willing, and able firms who can perform on county contracts. So we have a pretty broad definition of that, which is that firms do the work in one of these 5 categories, that they are in that relevant market, and that they have at least expressed interest in doing business with government by registering, certifying, pre-qualifying, bidding, getting an award, being paid, being a subcontractor. Somehow they have gotten into that pool of government lists, and that's what we call it, the list approach to availability, where we've taken governmental lists and kind of combined them all. And so if you look at this, you'll see that total minority, and also if you see, we broke it down by each ethnicity and gender group. So for minority-owned firms in construction, 33.23% of firms in the relevant market are minorities. Non-minority women, 5.95%. In engineering, 36.49% were minority-owned firms, 8.53% non-minority women. In professional services, consultants, 13.25% were minority-owned firms, 2.75% non-minority women. In other services, 13.91% were minority-owned firms, 2.39% non-minority women. And in goods, 8.68% were minority-owned firms, 2.40% were non-minority women. So then we looked at who were the firms you actually utilized during the study period. And so the numbers at the top are all the dollars you spent, all the vendor dollars that we categorized into each of these 5 categories, and on the bottom are the percentages. And you'll see that for minority-owned firms, in construction, 6.59%, for non-minority women in construction, 7.78%. In engineering, minority-owned firms were 6.82%, non-minority women-owned firms, 5.94%. And in professional services / consultants, both minority and women-owned firms were under 1%. And then in other services, minority-owned firms were 1.49%, and non-minority women were 0.02%. And then in goods, minority-owned firms were 8.11%, and non-minority women were 12 point, my eyes aren't quite that good. Let me look at it. 12.93%. I'm sorry. And then in total, minority-owned firms were 5.04%, non-minority women were 5.93%.
Excuse me, yes, go ahead, Commissioner, I have a question also. Did we assess data for service-disabled veterans as part of this study?
We did. We
Okay.
did do that as well. And
Okay.
do we have a slide in here for service-disabled veterans? Okay, we'll give you those numbers before the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank
For
you.
service-disabled veterans.
Yeah, and 2 more slides.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And Commissioner Burrow also had a question?
That was my question, if it
Okay.
was separate from these, or where, if it was included
Okay,
in a.
Yeah, because they overlap with the ethnicity and gender groups, so they're analyzed separately.
understood. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Go to the next slide. So with subcontractors, we did a separate analysis of subcontractors using subcontractor payments. And we had to do, because the county doesn't maintain subcontractor payment data, we sent a survey out to every prime who got an award over the study period except goods, where there are little or no subcontracting. And we asked them who their subs were and how much they paid them. And of course, you don't get back all of those. So it really is a sample, an analysis of sample responses. So we interpret those percentages as if we had gotten, all of the responses, that they are representative of the whole, because we don't find any kind of response bias in those who did respond. So again, you look at those percentages, and for minority-owned firms, 2.85% of subcontracting dollars. Non-minority women-owned firms, 8.13%. In engineering, minority-owned firms got 7.43%. Non-minority women, 6.93%. In professional services, none to minority-owned firms or non-minority women-owned firms. And the same was true in other services and, of course, in goods, where there's little or no subcontracting. So where you see the X's, this is now a disparity analysis where we compared utilization to availability. So if Hispanic American-owned firms were 10% of all of the engineers in the relevant market, did they get 10% of the dollars? So that's in essence the heart of a disparity analysis, a simple disparity analysis. So where you see the X's is where there was statistically significant underutilization. So if you take 100 as the place where availability and utilization meet, anything that's over that is, would be overutilization. Anything that is less than 80, so not just less than 100, but less than 80, would have an X in that box. So that means these are statistically significant underutilization where you see the X's. So in African American-owned firms were overutilized in goods, Asian American-owned firms were overutilized in construction, and non-minority women were overutilized in construction and in goods. And then for the service-disabled veterans, it was less than 1%. So if you see the note at the bottom, 0.12% was spent with SDVOSBs as prime contractors.
And just for clarification, where there's a blank box for non-minority women, you're stating that there's overutilization above 100, which would be that parity score between availability and utilization.
Yes. So it means their utilization percentage was higher than their availability percentage.
Okay. And then would we say the same thing when it comes to goods for African Americans?
Yes.
And then for Asian Americans for construction and goods?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So then we did the same thing for subcontracting. And in subcontracting, we had statistically significant underutilization in every category for every MWBE group except non-minority women in construction who were overutilized.
And just for this chart, for consistency's sake, the last three categories, we don't have enough information. It's not determinable at this point because we don't have real information on subcontractors.
Well, it is, in other words, we make an inference based on the survey that we did, the questionnaire that we sent out.
Okay.
So again, we don't have 100% back, but if you don't have any response bias, then the ones that do return them, it's like any survey, you look at what your responses are, and then you interpret that to the whole.
Okay.
And so we did use that to interpret to the whole,
I see.
percentage-wise.
I see. So we did receive some feedback.
Yes.
For those that, okay, thank you.
Yes, Gamble?
So how many surveys were sent out?
Can you pull up? We'll have to pull, we can find that information from you
Okay,
from
and then of
report.
the surveys that were sent out, how many were returned?
Trinity will report on that.
Thank you.
If you will reserve that.
So with these X's, these are bids that were awarded or contracts that were awarded in these categories, but we don't know percentage-wise of total contracts that were issued for proposals or bids, how many were in these minority categories
So,
overall,
so are you saying for prime or for subcontractors?
for any of them?
So for prime contractors, it is a full data set based on payments. So these are all payments made to all vendors over a 5-year period.
Right.
And it's broken, so those percentages are what dollars were actually paid to them over that period of time.
But that would be the amount paid to the companies that were awarded the bids, the contracts.
Yes.
But we don't know how many minority-owned business, women-owned business, Asian, African American, how many submitted proposals but didn't get the contract for a comparison of, what we're looking at.
So the comparison is, so we did include any firms who did not get contracts. So we did use your bid tabs in order to count them as available. So again, when we talk about that underutilization, who got the awards versus who's out there who could have gotten the awards, those bidders are included, the unsuccessful bidders are included in our count of available firms. So, but this disparity analysis is a pure comparison between who got awards or who got paid versus who could have had those awards and gotten paid. So it's what should be expected. So this disparity is a comparison between the two.
Okay,
I'm not sure
dollars.
if I'm properly understanding your
Yeah,
question.
so
Of
the-
dollars,
Yes,
but-
not for this one. The other slides refer to the participation.
Right, but I'm trying to get a grasp here of, there could be 10 bidders on a contract, but only one is going to get it based on a lot of different factors that our purchasing requirements are when they're sent out for bid. So there could have been, all 10 could have been minority-owned, or 9 out of 10 could have been minority-owned businesses that applied or submitted proposals, but a non-minority could have been the most qualified or the best price or all the point system, the factors involved. But that doesn't mean that they didn't get the opportunity or didn't get a chance to bid.
Right, so our analysis is not about whether, it's not really focused on whether firms had an opportunity to bid. It's an analysis of actual utilization compared to the availability of firms. So, and our analysis doesn't go down isn't so granular that we look at a bid by bid. So we didn't do an
Yeah.
analysis bid by bid. Under Croson, what we're really looking at is, were there disparities and therefore a legal kind of inference of discrimination based on industries, based on who was utilized, based on the availability of firms. So it wasn't based on whether firms have an opportunity to bid, although we did do a regression analysis that looks at whether there was a differential in bidding, whether minority firms were bidding on a relatively equal level as non-minority firms, which we'll get to shortly. But so we do look at that overall, whether could the disparity be explained because MWBEs were not bidding on the same level as non-minority firms, and that's part of the regression analysis.
Right, but, okay. I'm just concerned that, I know our purchasing department has strict requirements and a process that I'm not concerned about, because I know they're valid and integrities in there. Because people that don't get bids sometimes question that, but our procurement process is thorough and fair and across the board. So I'm just concerned that you're looking at the bids, the money that was awarded, and saying that there's a disparity among certain groups when we don't know if they applied or they weren't qualified or didn't get the bid, but they still were in the process, went through the process that was fair and equitable.
So one of the things that we do just past this, so we don't stop just at whether there's a statistical significant disparity. We also look at, we do a regression analysis, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is controlling for factors, other factors. So we control for, one of the things you have to say is what's the likely cause of the disparity? And so we have to look at, are there other race and gender neutral factors that could explain that disparity? Like the differential of size, how long they've been in business, the education of the owner, how many employees they have, the revenue, such things like that. And so we look at race and gender neutral factors and then determine whether they were the likely cause of the disparity. And if not, then we make an inference, again, there's an inference that the differential or the disparities were likely caused by the race and gender of the owners. So we do that in a regression analysis, look at the causation of the disparity.
Well,
Well, we'll get to that we'll talk about that in a second. We talk about the private sector analysis.
We did have another question.
Yeah, really just two follow-ups. I mean, one, I see the importance of this and know if there is a disparity, it allows us to ask why, right? So I understand the regression test, but the why could exist, the root cause analysis, and it can exist in a lot of different areas. It could be procedural, it could be language, it could be just different things that we may not be aware of, but without knowing that a disparity even exists, we can't even ask why. It could be education level, experience, it could be all those things, but we can't even get to that point. So certainly interested in seeing what results you have there to ask the right questions. But the second thing I had was around, so I see the numbers, the awards for the bids themselves. What I'm also interested in is if the regression testing that you did illustrates some data around the type of bids that the companies go after, meaning do we see a prevalence of bids for lower dollar projects or higher dollar projects, or a frequency amongst what gets rejected or approved depending on the dollar value of that project? Because that can also sway numbers, because we're not just looking at the number of companies available for a particular bid, but what kind of bids are even being sought after, and kind of that perspective.
Yeah, so our analysis doesn't go quite that down. What we do, though, is we do look at, is there a difference between the disparities? Again, ours is focused on a disparity research,
Correct.
and so we do have to make that differential between what is a disparity study and what is a methodology and the things that we look at for a disparity study versus if this were a management tool. We do try to make it as much of a management tool as we can, but really we're sticking to our research question, which is to see if there's a disparity between the utilization and the availability as industries. Right. And then we look for, how we can narrowly tailor some of our recommendations. So one of the things we did do is we did do a deep dive into policy, and then we'll be talking about that in a minute about our, our policy review and kind of what that revealed. But these are just kind of the bare bones statistical of availability, utilization, and disparity. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I was just curious if that level was there, because it is more around the definition of utilization, because utilization can mean a few different things. It could mean, one firm did get it, but they got a bid that was worth 80% of the dollar pie, and so that is it's a different representation versus numerically it's only one out of so many.
So that's interesting. That's what we call an outlier argument. And so, and we've seen that. We see that over and over again. And again, when you look at the study, you'll be able to see that. We do talk about it was X number of firms and how,
Okay.
so in the
some in
write-ups,
there.
it'll say there were X number of firms. And they got this number of dollars, African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Native American, and non-minority women compared to the non-MWBE group, and what was the average contract size. Okay. Or at least the average payment, so you'll see that as well.
Because that'll also illustrate something around the causation. If we do identify a cause,
Yeah.
having that parity there, you could even
Yeah, so
utilize
it
that.
is helpful to see that, to see the number. So with utilization, as you read the report, you'll see a table that says the number of firms and then the dollars, and the write-up will compare those. So you'll be able to see, is it that, they're getting a lot of contracts, but they're all little contracts? Or are they getting very few contracts, but they're big contracts or at least dollar-wise on par with the other ethnic and gender groups?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You can continue.
So to answer the question on the prime vendor questionnaire, we sent out 2,615 prime vendor questionnaires. There were 960 entries of data. Of course, some of them say they didn't have subs, so whether subs or not. There were 566 subcontractors, and there were about 200 respondents to the questionnaire. And that's pretty average in terms of the kinds of responses we get. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Egan, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm Vince Egan. I'm pinch hitting. David Maher, our partner in the legal division, wrote this chapter. We write a brief descriptive policy chapter giving sort of the institutional environment of the questions we're looking at in the data analysis. And I'll just hit on a couple of the highlights of this that can be relevant to this discussion we're having. And we interviewed a number of people in purchasing and various departments around the county. So the county does maintain a master vendor file and has a e-registration system for vendors, which is a good thing. For informal procurement, less than $50,000, they obtain quotes. There are no preferences or set-asides or other similar benefits for firms owned by women and minorities or veterans as part of informal procurement. Similarly, for formal procurement projects above $50,000, there are no preferences or set-asides or other similar benefits for women and minority-owned firms or veteran-owned firms. Hit the next slide. For professional services under $50,000, there's an abbreviated selection process for that. The county does allow for the use of master agreements and annual contracts for the purchases of goods and services that are of continuing or common need. For construction, particularly for the Cobb County Department of Transportation, that is one area where you do have what's known as a DBE program, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, where if you receive federal money that comes through the Georgia Department of Transportation, you're supposed to seek the use of women, minority, and disadvantaged firms on those federal projects. The staff reported in interviews that it was fairly difficult to meet goals with these prime contractors from their reporting based on capacity needs. I want to jump over to bonding and insurance. This is all fairly standard. In some of the studies we do, we get bonding and insurance concerns as reported as obstacles. These were not primary barriers reported in the survey discussion, which will be discussed later.
Okay, sir, we do have one question
Okay,
that came
go
up
ahead.
on that slide.
Yeah, just, I wanted to just confirm, for the analysis at the beginning, that was walked through at the beginning, that did include Project Blossom bids as well?
Yes.
Okay, because the dollar number seemed a little bit low to have all of the projects in there, but that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, we usually do a prime vendors, we report before we do the analysis, we show the numbers and the numbers we got and ask, does this make sense? Are we leaving out stuff? And not simply the aggregate, but the contractors and the projects they did. It's reviewed before we pursue it.
Thank you.
But again, certain things can be left out because it was not part of the time period or is outside of the relevant market. The firms were not located in the relevant market, so that's why it won't match up exactly as well.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Prompt payment is a concern. We-
Excuse me, sir.
Go
I'm sorry,
ahead.
we have another
Oh, I'm
question.
sorry.
No, I have a question regarding construction and staff's feedback regarding the difficulty in meeting the goals. Did they expound, or can you share a little bit about what the challenges were for the capacity issues?
Well, it was sort of twofold, and not uncommon that they didn't find enough firms with capacity to work on road projects, as it was explained to us. And secondly, those firms that did have some of the capacity were tied up with other projects. That was an impression of staff.
Okay, but just for clarification, capacity, you're referring to staffing, equipment. I'm just looking for a little bit more, I guess, of a description of what they define as capacity.
Yeah, this is what was reported to us
Okay.
by staff, so.
Okay,
It was
thank
just
you.
that general statement.
Commissioner,
Okay,
a lot of times when we're talking about DOT projects and capacity, it is the firm's ability to be able to start, initiate, implement, and complete that project within the time frame that they would like to have it done. So when they say capacity, that's what they're talking about. And it could be various things that prohibit them to be able to get that project
Okay.
over the finish line and complete.
okay. Yeah, that's kind of what I was looking for a little
Yes,
bit. I just
ma'am.
wasn't sure if that was limited to, let's say, staff and the number of staff, or it could be a
It could
time
be.
constraint as well, is
Yes,
what I'm
ma'am.
hearing. There are other, okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thanks.
And we've had that in water. If you may recall, some of the agendas we bring back from the water department, and the cost may be a little bit more from the firms that bid on it, and we're asking the board to choose that firm that may not be the lowest, because the lowest bidder could not get, due to capacity and workload, couldn't get it done, so that may be. So it's just a variety. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Could be that.
Commissioners, did you have any other questions? May continue, Commissioner Gamble?
I just had a comment for Commissioner Richardson. We have to remember in their study where they're putting the 24 million for SPLOST. Their study started in 2018, so the biggest portion of the 2016 SPLOST had already been bid out, and we were getting to the lower portion of bidding out, because I questioned that too, looking at the total amount of dollars that were put out didn't make sense. But if you remember how the funding works, if that helps.
Let me also clarify, that 24 million is just for the program management. It's not, program management is not the aggregate of all of the projects in the program. It's for the managing company, and I believe that there is a partnership of two organizations that are managing that program, and I believe that multiple departments, I know Parks and Recreation has a program manager that manages their projects also. Okay.
Okay. We also looked at, the prompt payment policy, which is pay net 30 days, but there are no provisions for primes to pay promptly subcontractors. However, for transportation projects, the county's unwritten policy is to ask prime contractors to pay their subcontractors even before receiving payment from Cobb County DOT. And again, prompt payment is one reason some firms don't like to seek work from government agencies, because they feel like the pay can be too slow. On outreach, the procurement department has been taking a number of initiatives to put on how to do business seminars, both virtual and in persons, meeting with chambers of commerce, small business roundtables, email blasts, virtual meetings with small business, giving out contract opportunities, going to trade shows. So the county has taken a number of affirmative measures, to be welcoming to new contractors. The county does have a local vendor presence preference for professional service contracts, and also giving a preference to local firms in the event of a tie bid, which is fairly common kind of practice. And finally, as I've said, the county does not have any race or gender conscious policies at present, but encourages firms owned by women and minorities to self-identify with the county. It did establish in 2021 a supplier diversity program from which all of this increased outreach activities flow, and the tracking of county utilization of diverse businesses. So the county does not have staff devoted to this topic per se, a whole separate office, but the purchasing does have 13 full-time positions working in purchasing as a whole. Questions about that?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. All right, so this next section is going to talk
Sir,
about
can you just let us know, can you just let us know your name?
Oh, I'm sorry. I get right into it. My bad.
Yeah.
My Chicago's coming out. Jason Coupe. I am Dr. Jason Coupe. I'm an economist with Griffin and Strong and a professor in the policy school at Georgia State. All right, so this section is going to talk about the private sector. A couple of things to note about this section going forward. So the first thing is, this is more about the marketplace, right? So municipalities purchase services from a market. That market can have discrimination embedded in it that sometimes purchasing can unintentionally pick up on. So it's important to sort of think about the overall marketplace when we're analyzing this. The second big thing is most of these findings use what's called a regression analysis. So for those of you who may remember your stats class, it's sort of a model that tries to account for as many other factors alongside a sort of race and gender and veteran status, as much of that as we can to sort of think about, to find some of those disparities in the marketplace and think about what other things that could be going on that account for it, if that makes sense. So, all right, so I'm trying not to egg it out too much on these findings, so please just stop me if there are questions. So the first big finding that we found was that MWBE firms have smaller revenue shares. So the idea behind that is we construct a measure that picks up how much of the revenue in an overall marketplace that MWBE firms have relative to their market size. And so intuitively, those things would be the same, right? If, for instance, MWBE firms make up 20% of a market, we would expect them to take in 20% of the overall revenues if things were equal. We don't find that that's the case, right? MWE firms take in a much smaller portion of the revenue relative to their market size. So this data comes from the census, the American Business Survey. And again, this is regression based, so we're accounting for firm size, owner education, et cetera, et cetera. All right, the second big finding, and this one pops up throughout both this and the anecdotal chapter, the capacity of MWE firms is lower, right? So we look at, again, controlling for other factors, owner education, number of employees, et cetera. The capacity, so the total payroll is lower, which sort of suggests that MWE firms can be smaller, right? And in a marketplace, that matters when economies of scale are at play. So MWE firms have lower capacity. This next data point comes from the building permit data that was shared. So MWBE building permit shares were lower relative to non-whites. We looked at a couple of relative non-MWBE firms, right? So we looked at a couple of different data points there. MWBE firms constituted about 2% of the building permits issued. We also looked at the volume of work. Right, so the average job value for, so in the building permit data, we had data on the two sort of African-American owned firms and women-owned firms. Those are the two data points that popped out. African-American owned firms, the average job value was about $500,000, and for non-African-American owned firms, it was about $650,000, right? So smaller job value, this goes alongside the capacity finding. We noticed an even more poignant disparity with regard to women-owned firms, right? So the average job value of women-owned firms is about $220,000 compared to, again, about $650,000 on average for firms that are not owned by women. We found in African-American households, so these next few data points also come from the census, so I apologize, we're sort of jumping data sets here. We use a lot of different information to try to contextualize the marketplace. This next data set, then these next few points come from the census. Can you go back one? Sorry, all good. All right, so census data, African-American headed households are less likely to be self-employed. So this is regression based. This accounts for education level, et cetera, a number of different sort of race-neutral factors. About 2.8% of African-American headed households report to be self-employed, compared with about 4% of white American households as identified by the census. The number doesn't sound like much, but as a percentage, it actually is quite drastic and statistically significant, right? So you're looking at about, 3 out of 4. It's a 25% gap there. Again, sort of noted, indicative of structural barriers sort of in the marketplace. There's just sort of fewer firms. Women-headed households are also less likely to be self-employed, so similar numbers there. About 3% of the women-headed households, again, as identified in the census, report to be self-employed, compared to about 4% of households not headed by women. This, again, is controlling for other factors. Okay, cool. Wait, where are we? Okay, sorry, still on the census. We did not find disparities in Hispanic American, Native American, and Asian American headed households as far as who was more or less likely to be reported to be self-employed. So nothing to note there. Controlling for other factors, those were about on par as the reference group, which were sort of white male-headed households. We found that veteran-headed households, households that were reported to be headed by veterans, were actually more likely to be self-employed by about 1.5 percentage points. Also statistically significant. Everything else going forward, so we're done with census data. Everything else going forward is regarding the survey that the GSPC puts out, right? So different data set here, a little bit of a smaller sample, so I'll try to contextualize it as best I can. African American and Asian American owned firms, we found were more likely to report to be subcontractors than the reference group, which were firms owned by white men, right? So there weren't any differences in the survey regarding who reported to be prime. Asian American owned firms, interestingly, were more likely to serve as both prime and subcontractors, so that sort of popped out in the survey. And women-owned firms were about half as likely to report as subs than white male-owned firms. All right, again, this similar finding to previous stuff. African American-owned firms were smaller, right? So controlling for other factors, including owner education level, owner experience level, et cetera, et cetera. African American-owned firms tend to be smaller than white American male-headed owned firms, which is the reference group here. Again, fewer employees, fewer gross revenues, indicative of a smaller capacity. African American and women-owned firms are more likely to be registered to do business with Cobb County, right? So controlling for other factors, about 2.5 times more likely than white male-owned firms to be registered to do business. Women-owned firms are about 50% more likely than non-minority men in the reference group to be registered to do business with Cobb. So no big, MW firms seem to be more likely to be registered to do business. The ones that we picked up in the survey anyway. Hispanic American, with the exception of Hispanic American-owned firms, they were about half as likely to be registered to do business with Cobb. All right, we found that no disparity with regard to the degree to which MWBE firms were likely to report submitting bids, right? So they, in the survey, report that they submit bids at about the same rate, controlling for other factors. We found that Asian American-owned firms are more likely to submit a bid to a private entity. That gap was not huge, but other than that, no disparity picked up there. We did find that African American and Asian-owned firms were less likely to be awarded contracts from Cobb County, controlling for other factors. So African American-owned firms were 5% less likely, and Asian American-owned firms were about 11% less likely to report being awarded a contract by Cobb County. This is controlling for, again, owner education level, owner experience level, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's the big finding there. We found that MWE firms also reported significant barriers to bid submissions. Sort of touches on one of the questions from earlier. So in controlling for other factors, African American firms were significantly more likely to note that financing and access to competitive supplier pricing were barriers to bid submission. We have evidence of this in the anecdotal chapter 2. We found that women-owned firms skip on there. Asian-owned firms are more likely to report that language is a barrier, but that was the only group that reported there. And then women-owned firms reported a couple of barriers too. They were more likely to report personnel barriers, again, indicative of capacity that sort of we find throughout. African-American-owned firms were also more likely to report that contract size was a barrier to bidding, right? So again, indicative of capacity in the marketplace. African-American-owned firms reported to have more business loan denials. This was stark, right? So of the respondents in the survey, and again, controlling for other factors, owner experience, owner education level, et cetera, African-American-owned firms were 5 times more likely to report having had a business loan denied, right? So again, related to that, to the capacity issue present in the marketplace. All right, a couple other things to note. African-American and Asian-owned firms were more likely to perceive discrimination in both the public and private sectors. So again, controlling for other factors, African-American firms were about twice as likely to report. Asian-American firms were about 3 times more likely to report significant discrimination in the marketplace. This is both by Cobb County and by private firms that they maybe seek to work with. African-American-owned firms were significantly more likely to perceive that contracting is governed by informal networks. And both African-American and Asian-owned firms perceived that informal networks prevented them from winning bids. It's just what was reported in the survey. Last big finding, MWE firms reported perceived double standards in both the public and private sectors. Again, dovetails with the earlier finding, reporting that bids are insufficiently reviewed, both by Cobb and the private sector. So, all right, those are the big findings from the overall marketplace. I'm going to
All right, thank you. So I will be providing a little bit of background information on how we collected the anecdotal evidence. So this is a part of the study where we were able to get direct communication from the community about their experiences doing business or attempting to do business with the county. So we collected anecdotal evidence in a number of ways here. Michelle mentioned before, but we did this by putting together what we call our master outreach list, which consisted of Cobb's vendor list as well as other third-party lists such as Atlanta's list as well as GDOT and other local government entities. So we had an informational meeting where this session we were able to connect with the community and just let them know about the study and how they can participate. We had 82 attendees there. We had interviews with organizations as well as 4 businesses actually wanted to interview, and those weren't randomly selected. We also did a survey of business owners where we had 263 completed surveys. We had 4 public communication sessions. We actually had 2 in English and 2 in Spanish. And then one of the Spanish sessions we did with the Georgia Contractors Association. We had anecdotal interviews, 33 of those. We had 6 focus group sessions, one of them with the service disabled veteran-owned small businesses, as well as one in Spanish. And then we also collected email and social media comments, and we had 3 participants provide that information. And so as far as outreach, we did that in a number of ways: social media, LinkedIn. We also, Cobb helped us a lot with the BidNet, and we did some outreach there, which was really helpful. We also sent email blasts through Constant Contact, and we sent a press release out for the information session, public communication sessions, and the survey through PR Newswire. And we provided Spanish translations for those. And then we also, through our master outreach list, sent email blasts through those. All right, so I will briefly discuss the anecdotal findings. They overlap with the private sector findings, so I'll try to touch on the highlights. So we did notice that there was gaps in equity. This was mentioned during our interviews as well as our survey. Notably, there was more than 80% of bi and multiracial Asian and African Americans that said that they generated $1 million or less in 2022. And then we had about 60% of Hispanic Americans saying the same. And then we also had more than 70% of MBEs that stated that they were not awarded a prime contract during the study period. As far as barriers in participation, we had 18.2% of Hispanic Americans, 12.8% of African Americans, and 10% of Asian Americans who indicated that the contract was too large for them to bid, compared to 7.1% of white American males. We also asked in our survey, how many times have you been denied a commercial loan? And we had about 88.1% of white American males say none, where 44% of African Americans, 37.5% of bi multiracial, 20% of Asian Americans, and 18.2% of Hispanic Americans said that they have been rejected at least one time. And then we had about 20% of African and Asian Americans saying that financing was a barrier to bid, which Dr. Coupe did mention before. For informal networks, we did notice a trend of informal networks throughout all of anecdotal collection. So specifically with the survey, we found that about 60% of all respondents said that there were informal networks. So for outreach and registration, we found that those who were not registered, 60% of bi and multiracials, 57.1% of Asian Americans, 50% of Hispanic Americans indicated that they didn't know how to register. And so this was a common trend as well. And then some people indicated that they didn't register because they didn't think that they would be able to receive an award. For perceptions of bias, we had about 40 to 50% of African and Asian Americans who stated that primes contacted them, but essentially there was no consideration of award. And then there were about 27 to 30% of Asian and African Americans saying the same for service-disabled veteran-owned businesses. And then we had about 32% of African Americans saying or agreeing with the topic of service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses being viewed as less competent. All right, I'll pass it on to Michelle Cart-Jenkins to discuss the overall findings.
Okay. So our overall findings was that the county has a factual basis for establishing some race and gender conscious program elements in addition to the race and gender neutral efforts that it already has. This is important because, again, that's the whole purpose of a disparity study, again, to come back and determine whether the county has a factual predicate in order to take any race and gender, use any race or gender tools. The regression analysis found that disparities by race, ethnicity, and gender status of the firm owners remained after controlling for capacity and other race and gender neutral factors, and the anecdotal and policy findings support the statistical analysis and the regression analysis. So we'll move on to our commendations. There are a number of things that you all are doing that we think are great and that you should continue doing them. First, we commend you for instituting your supplier diversity program even ahead of having a disparity study. We commend you for applying your small business and New Start incentive to assist small local businesses. That's really great. We like that. There are a couple of things you're doing that we'll put in our tool belt to even recommend to others. That may be one of them. We commend you for the lack of complaints regarding insurance from the vendor community. Now, that may sound like, why are you telling us that we're doing something, that there are a lack of complaints, is because we do this all over the country, and insurance complaints are one of the things we regularly get, and we didn't have a lot of those from your vendors. We commend you for providing a rotation of contractors and vendors from which quote requests are made. This is critical because quotes are on smaller contracts. And one of the things that stuck with me when we were doing this work during the pandemic is there were small firms who said, listen, a $10,000 contract to me right now would have saved my company. And so by you, even on these smaller contracts, when there are quotes and you are rotating those, that's a really good policy. And we commend the county for investing in the supplier diversity management system, B2G now. That's a big step in being able to do some of the things that we'll recommend later regarding your data. So now I'm going to move on to recommendations, and although I'm going to go through them, our CEO, Attorney Strong, is standing next to me because he's kind of the guru in this area. So when you ask questions about our recommendation, he's going to be the one that probably will be able to give you the most comprehensive answers. But we start with data reform because all the other things we recommend to you, if you don't put some of these data reforms in place, will be for naught because you won't be able to properly track them and you won't have the information that you need as a result of them. One of the collateral benefits of us doing this disparity study is that we have been more than elbow deep in all of your data. So remember, we've looked at every payment to vendors for 5 years. We looked at all of your awards. We looked at your vendor data. We took your bid tabs and entered them. So, and again, the subcontractor issue, having done the subcontractor, the vendor questionnaire in order to get subcontractors. So one of the things we recommended is that you standardize and incorporate contract numbers as a field across all data files in order to streamline your database relations. One of the problems our data analysts had was sometimes we couldn't match up a contract to like payments or to some other things because it wasn't a consistent field in all your data. So we would recommend that. Of course, we recommend that you track all subcontractors across all industry categories. That's why we had to do a prime vendor questionnaire, was because you did not maintain this data. Bid tabs. Bidders are really a gold mine of information and a gold mine of ready, willing, and able and competitive firms to be doing work for the county. But because you don't have a database of them and they don't have to register in order to bid, they kind of are stealth. They can come in and go out, and you don't even have their information necessarily to even tell them that new bids are coming out that may be right up their alley, and they don't become part of your vendor pool or vendors you build a relationship with. So we think that it should be mandatory for vendors to register before they place a bid. And again, doesn't have to be a complicated registration if you want to have, 2 tiers of registration, but you should have some way to know that a vendor's in there other than the fact that they just put in a bid, because your bid tabs, we manually entered those. So those aren't in a database anywhere. So that's another option, which is at least to have a bidder database, but we entered those, and of course, that's your data. All of the data we have, by the way, is yours, and we already have shared some of it with your team, and of course, all of it is available to go back to you. And some of the things maybe you haven't been maintaining, we always recommend that since we've already entered 5 years worth of it, it might be something you can just keep going. We also want to make sure we mention to allocate resources and staffing. So some of the things we are mentioning will take additional staff and will take additional resources. And so that's a big consideration as you consider implementing and accepting our recommendations. is we know sometimes there's a gap between the, we have present staff, what can we do with the present staff? But also, what are those resources that will be allocated moving forward? So our first recommendation, kind of outside of the administrative side of it, is a commercial non-discrimination policy. And we recommend that you implement a policy that permits investigation into possible intentional discrimination in cases where the lowest bidding prime contractor has failed to utilize MWBEs where there is a demonstrated availability on a contract basis and upon a review of the availability of commodity codes of the scopes of work in that contract. So what we're talking about is giving an authorization that when firms, particularly over and over again, fail to use minority and women-owned firms as subcontractors, and you saw those numbers as subcontractors, they're low in some areas, that you have the ability and the authorization to ask a bunch of questions and to find out what, in fact, they've done to try to encourage or try to use MWBEs.
So I'm assuming that there are other jurisdictions that have implemented something similar to this. Just wondering who would hold that accountability of the due diligence on that? How would that determination of discrimination occurring be identified? Like, would that be a third party that normally handles it? Is it the county attorney's office? How does that manifest?
Yes, Commissioner, Rodney Strong. Typically, the initial investigation would be by your team internally to your Office of Supply Diversity, and they would just basically pose some inquiries, very basic inquiries, because there's a pattern of certain circumstances that raise red flags as to whether a company is intentionally excluding contractors that they may not have previously utilized. And one of your objectives ultimately in that type of office is to make sure that the prime contractors are looking at a broad pool of subcontractors. And so when a lot of times you get sometimes information from subs where they come in and say, hey, we've been trying to get them to take our bid. They didn't seem to be that interested. We had problems. There are other things, but there are various red flags that get raised. So that kicks in at that level. And then if it gets to a point where it looks that there has to be some kind of action taken, it probably needs to be, at that point, that report that's done internally by your team probably needs to be kicked over for review by the county attorney.
Okay, because having something like this infers it's a bad apple versus a systemic policy issue. And so, certainly I want to find bad apples in non-discrimination, but it's kind of a self-accountable model. So I was just curious if that there were other models, but I appreciate.
Yeah, I think the idea is that your team will be seeing these bids come in consistently. They'll have some idea where either they will get reports, which happens when you have a team that's dedicated and people know that they can reach out to them when they don't feel like they're being treated fairly, or there can be things in the pattern that they're looking at in the documents that come in that cause them to dig a little deeper. And what this type of policy does is it creates the legal basis for them to do that basic investigation that then gets kicked over for further detailed investigation.
Thank you for the clarity.
I also think this is important for large contracts particularly, when you're talking about smaller contracts, but when you've got large contracts, libraries, stadiums, whatever it is, and you start to see, and as we're going to recommend some goal-setting processes, but that they're not meeting those goals and every other bidder is, then there's some conversations that you want to have, and you want to make sure you have authority to have those conversations. So our next is aspirational contract by contract goals. And so aspirational, and I actually would like to change the names of this a little bit to call them benchmarking, annual benchmarks, because sometimes people confuse all the different kinds of goals. But what this is it's an internal measure that says, are we where we should be? And that's also a benefit of this disparity study, is for every group, whether it's race or gender, or whether it's a race-neutral group, is where should we be given the availability of these firms in the marketplace? And so this internal benchmark is a way to measure yourself on an annualized basis. Are we where we should be? Some jurisdictions have used this as a departmental performance measure. So where are these departments? How are they performing in this area in terms of using minority and women-owned firms? And we can help your staff to develop these. They're basically set based on availability, but they don't necessarily have to start at availability. That's where you're trying to get to, and you would never set your goals above availability. But for example, if you've got 20% availability, but your attainment so far has only been 2%, to set a goal, an internal aspirational goal of 20% for next year would be kind of a recipe for failure. So what you want to do is set stepping stones to get to availability over a period of time if that's necessary. We also recommend aspirational contract. You want to go back one more? These aspirational contract-by-contract goals, which are, when you're setting, those are now an external goal setting, as opposed to the one I just spoke about setting benchmarks that are internal. These are goals that you would set for your primes in terms of their utilization of MWBEs. And so in your solicitation, you would set a goal based on the scopes of work for that project. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not, well, availability in construction was 20%, so we're setting a 20% goal on every contract. What you do is, there's a calculation, again, we'll walk through your staff on how you do this, very similar to the federal DBE program and how they set goals. You look at the scopes of work in each contract, and you look at the availability of MWBEs in those categories, and then there's kind of a computation you can do to get to what the goal should be on that contract. You can do this, it is best practice to kind of do this detailed computation, but you can also just adjust it. So it doesn't always have to be a detailed computation. It can sometimes be, I think what matters and what we found the courts care about is that you're not using one size fits all, but you're adjusting goals on a contract by contract basis. So once a goal is set on a contract, then that should be put into your solicitation, and the firms that come back, whatever they come back with, that would become their contract commitment if they go forward with a contract. We were not, and then you could still do your investigation if you found out that a firm was substantially under that goal. If you set a 20% goal and a firm comes in at 18%, that would be acceptable. But if you start seeing everybody else is coming in at 20% and you've got a firm and you've put it in your solicitation and firms are coming in at 1 or 2%, then it might trigger that commercial non-discrimination policy investigation. So our next recommendation is the Small Business Reserve. It's my personal favorite because what it is that you create a threshold under which only small businesses can bid. So it's kind of a small business set-aside. We did hear complaints about, and I think you just heard them, about unfair competition and these large contracts, and we can't bid on large contracts. And then we had about 25% of firms who told us that there was unfair competition with large firms. And so we love this when it's a race and gender neutral remedy, one of the tools in the toolbox that we think will also assist MWBE firms. So you set that threshold, and under that, only small businesses can bid against one another. It helps in three areas. One, it helps firms that have been traditionally subcontractors, and again, part of the statistics we heard is that MWBEs will tend to be subcontractors and not primes, but you have plenty of small contracts that they could be bidding on, even as small businesses. So what you want to do is try to migrate them so that they come over to becoming primes. And we know that once firms become a prime, even on a small contract, they kind of get the hang of it, and then they start to grow their capacity and start to bid on larger and larger contracts, and that obviously increases competition. In that, they will need supportive services, so I'll get to that in a second, talk about supportive services for that. You want to say something?
No, you.
Okay. So joint ventures is one that we really recommend. The county has 113 contracts that were listed over $5 million, and there were 10 contracts over $10 million. So we recommend that there be a joint venture requirement for any contract over $5 million with firms, so that the prime would have to joint venture with a firm that doesn't look like them. This has been very successful. City of Atlanta has had this in place for 30 years, Rodney, thereabout?
Probably over 40 years.
30, 40 years, and it's been very successful in growing the capacity of firms and helping them to participate at higher levels. Rodney, you want to talk about this as being a successful tool?
Well, it's a tool to allow some of the prime contractors who might not be capable of performing independently. You heard the information from Dr. Coupe and from Dr. Egan about some of the concerns about the larger contracts and the capacity of firms on those larger contracts. And so what that does is it allows firms to participate on some of your larger contracts at the prime level. It allows those firms to gain experience. You can put requirements in it that will grow some of the base here in Cobb County. It's had a remarkable effect for a lot of our clients. And as Michelle mentioned, it's well known that Atlanta has more large minority contractors than anywhere else in the country, and that's largely because those firms had an opportunity to participate on the larger projects first as a joint venture partner, and then, of course, were large enough to bid independently for those projects. And so we just think it's a good tool. We think the data is supportive of it. One of the things that I did want to say is that, everything that we're doing here in making recommendations has a lot to do with your management and how you manage your project, but that's not how you manage your procurement process. But this is really not a management study. It's really designed to address the concerns of the courts. And the concerns of the courts are that if you are going to have any kind of program to deal with, and these are the two concerns that the courts outline, discrimination and the present effects of past discrimination, okay? And that sounds, legalistic. But if you think about it, if you go into any community that has previously been redlined, nobody has to tell you it's a community that's previously been redlined. As soon as you drive down the street, you say, oh, I see the change in this community. Why? And so what are you dealing with? You're dealing with the present effects. You might not even have any current redlining going on, but you see the effects. And it's the same thing with business formation, business growth, capacity, those kinds of things. And so in order to do these relatively benign things we're recommending, you have to have the authority to do it. And so much of our research has been, is there enough there in terms of what the courts say, which is there an imbalance between availability and utilization? Is there, when you control for capacity, when you control for certain factors such as, years in business, education of owners, those kinds of things. After doing all those things, do you still show up with a disparity? And if you do, is there anecdotal evidence that buttresses the idea that companies are still experiencing difficulties in the marketplace? Then you can take certain steps. And so all of these steps are tied to that. And the joint venture piece is sort of one tool in the toolbox, as Michelle likes to say, that I think is really important to begin to grow some of your firms and help them catapult from, a mid-sized firm into a, substantial firm that employs more people in your county. Michelle.
Thank you. So forecasting and supportive services are important. We heard a lot, and I think Trinity talked about the percentages of firms who said that there was an informal network. So that is, there are firms who get information and know things ahead of everybody else because they have a relationship with the county already. And so one of the ways to shortcut that is forecasting, which is not waiting to tell the community that there are certain contracts coming out just when the RFP goes out, but letting them know as soon as you know. And pretty much a good practice is once your budgets are done, you know what is coming up. So that allows for more supportive services to help firms. It allows for proactive contract compliance in terms of assessing who's out there, asking firms to being proactive about getting them registered and certified with you, and bringing them kind of into the fold. If you know there's a firm down the street who could perform some of the services you have coming up on a big contract, then you can go after that firm and say, listen, we have something coming up. You might be interested in getting yourself registered so that you're notified about that upcoming award. So forecasting, I think Fulton County does about 18 months out. They do forecasting. I think that's probably the longest time I've seen, but kind of the typical forecasting period is about a year. And then supportive services, that would be needed with this small business reserve. Again, this helping firms moving from subcontractors to being primes. Supportive services, really we're at a time when supportive services are really critical. They don't always have to be things that you're doing directly, but you have a lot of resources locally to assist you with some of those supportive services.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. Yeah, I'd like to add just a comment to just a little, to illustrate a little bit about this particular recommendation. It's one that we think is one of the stronger recommendations because it's been proven in a very difficult marketplace. It's not something that the city of Atlanta historically has done, and I wasn't familiar with it from my experience with Atlanta or hadn't seen it in other places, but we did a project a few years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, where we worked really closely with 15 different cities looking at their procurement inclusion efforts. And one of those cities was the city of Chicago. And they instituted this program under their previous chief procurement officer, Jamie Ree, who's now the general manager of their airports. And it worked really, really well for them because what they would do is they would put out a book. Now, this was before they started doing it before it became something that you could just do online. And they would put out a book a year in advance when the budget came out and they knew what projects the various departments were going to request of the procurement department. They demanded that every department turn in, these are the projects we intend to bid next year. And so they got that book out, and then they would have a outreach meeting to all of the minority contractors and say, these are the things that we got coming up next year. And then they would have another meeting where they would have prime contractors meet with the minority contractors in order to begin to build relationships so that, they would just say, we want to put you all in the room. We want you all to know you all are interested in these projects. These are the primes that are interested in these projects. This is an opportunity for you all to have teaming arrangements. And it became it was an extremely successful project. And of course, it worked as you all are aware, Chicago is one of the largest, municipalities in the country, and it's worked extremely well there. I mentioned the fact that, Director Ree has moved from procurement to the airports. because now they're using it at the airports in Chicago also, and it's working out real well. And we've made this recommendation, and it's being used by some of our other clients, including the city of Memphis and a few other places. And it's worked out extremely well in terms of increasing participation. And it's a race-neutral method. You're basically just giving people advance notice, and then you're putting people together to give them an opportunity to get to know each other and break down barriers prior to opportunities before the bid comes out and hits the street.
Also, I mean, if you're going to do things like joint ventures, that's kind of impossible to do with, 8 weeks once an RFP comes out, teaming arrangements and those kind of things. So you want to give as much time as possible. So our next recommendation was unbundling contracts. Again, we saw a lot of, in the anecdotal, we had about 18% of Hispanic respondents, 12% of African American respondents, and 10% of Asian American respondents said the contracts were too large for them to bid on. That's compared to 7.1% of white male respondents. And so one of the things to consider is unbundling some of these large contracts. We know that administratively it is much more expedient to just put out one large contract. But again, based on some sort of a priority of benefiting local and local small firms, that sometimes could be other ways of doing it. We just completed a study about a year ago for the city of Toledo, Ohio, and they had previously put out one big mowing contract to the whole city every year. And that year, they decided to do a mowing program where they split the city up, and instead of having one big mowing contract, they had, you have this part of the city, you have and gave it to numerous small mowing firms. It was so successful that they're continuing it, and they're also looking for other areas where they could do that. And it was a wonderful program that worked out for them. So look for those opportunities where, even though it's easier to just put out one big contract, where you could unbundle them and give particularly small businesses an opportunity. We also recommend contract financing. You heard a lot about the disparities in loan denials, and one of the things that helps is if the county made arrangements with local banks so that contractors could factor their contracts with Cobb County with those banks. The New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority has a MTA small business loan program that partners with local banks to provide loans. So theirs works so, if you have a contract with the MTA, you can go to this bank, and that bank will help to factor it, and of course then you get your payments, and I guess they go through the bank. But it really does help small firms, particularly if there are delays in getting payments, and it helps them also, of course, to pay their subcontractors sooner. So we have found that this is really a good program for you all to consider. And then implementing an SDVOSB, a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business presence program. We aren't recommending a goal-based program because there were only 72 service-disabled veterans, and that winds up being, giving a contract to someone because there's such a small number of them. But we do think that it's beneficial to give them a preference, and it is not the same hurdle you have to jump for race and gender for these race and gender neutral groups like service-disabled veterans. It's judged differently in the courts. It's a rational basis test versus what's called a strict scrutiny test for when you're using race. So in being a rational basis test, you really just have to have a good reason, and that's the fact that you want to benefit them because of their service to the country is enough of a reason for you to give them a preference. And so we think that would be a good program. I think that was our last recommendation. Is there another one?
No, I think that's it.
Oh,
What's
okay.
an
All right, so we're open for any additional questions you
Yes,
have.
just on that last point, what's an example of a preference? Is it similar to our local vendor program where we might add an additional point when, okay.
Yeah, you might add additional points. Sometimes it's if they're within 10% of the lowest bidder, you allow them to match that lowest bidder's price. You know, that's another way to do it.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, I'm presuming all of us may have questions, so I'm going to start with you, Commissioner Gamble. I'll just go down the aisle.
Sure, just I haven't had answers to my previous questions as far as how many people were sent. It was on the one page towards the end that you showed, the green boxes.
Yes, she provided numbers.
No, she provided how many responded. They did not provide how many they sent it to.
I have both. Yes, 2615 were sent out to
Where
the
are you finding
primes
that?
from what she stated.
From that orange sheet on Trinity's desk.
Okay,
Two surveys.
I don't have the orange sheet.
We don't have it either. She read from it.
Responded.
No,
They just looked it up.
She looked it up, but you can read it again.
There were two
Michelle.
surveys.
I can read it again,
Read
that's
it
not a
again, Michelle.
problem. It was 2,615.
And was that emails or was it social media? Because you said you used social media, LinkedIn, email, and press releases.
So for the prime vendor questionnaire, it actually went out snail mail and then was followed up it was followed up by email and by telephone.
And it was the same 2,600 number
Yeah.
that you just
Yeah.
gave us? And how did you get that number?
How did-
How did you get those 2,600 email addresses?
We got them from your data and from we used all of your data from firms that you had who had gotten payments. So again, it was all the firms who had gotten payments over a 5-year period, except for those in goods. So every prime in construction, every category got that snail mail and then got a follow-up and then got a phone call if they hadn't responded in construction.
My only other, and this is not a question for you, it is a comment directed at Mr. Ball and then also to our county attorney's office. Before we proceed down this path, it's my understanding that a Harvard University diversity ruling by the Supreme Court has recently come up. And I haven't been able to read it, but it is no longer permissible for legal for governments to use preferences in most cases. So prior to us continuing down this path, I would ask that we review that ruling.
Commissioner, I'd like to address that. Want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Harvard case. And there's a distinction, and there are two different lines of cases in the law of equal protection under the 14th Amendment related to public contracting and related to college admissions. That sounds strange, and it is a little strange, but it has to do with a decision that came out of the Supreme Court in the 1970s. I believe it was 1978, and it was University of California Systems versus Bakke versus University of California. And there was a decision that was made that basically that decision, the Bakke decision, said that one of the rationales for having a preference for underutilized minorities in admissions could be diversity. So diversity was enshrined in constitutional law as a basis for educational preferences. In the case of the Bakke case, it involved the medical school in California, public medical school, where they set aside a certain number of slots for underrepresented minority groups. The court said you couldn't do that, but you could use diversity as a plus factor in making a determination as to whether or not you would admit someone to medical school or to any other school. And they cited the type of program that had been in place at Harvard University. And so most colleges and universities, elite colleges and universities and graduate schools of professional schools, put in place a program that we generally call the Harvard Plan, where one of the factors in admissions could be you were part of an underrepresented minority. That was litigated a number of times. There were 2 cases that came out in the late, I think 2010, I think was the last one. There was the Grutter v. Bollinger case that ultimately came out. We litigated a case here in Georgia. In fact, I was one of the lawyers on that case representing the University of Georgia. And ultimately it got consolidated in Grutter v. Bollinger, and diversity was upheld at that time. There was another case, Fisher v. Texas, that came out, about 8 years ago. They upheld diversity. Most recently, that was challenged again in the case called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard College and Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Those 2 cases were consolidated as one case. And the Supreme Court basically said that diversity rationale that had previously been approved by the courts was no longer constitutional. It was no longer acceptable. They reversed their previous decisions, all of their previous line of cases, and said that diversity could not be a factor anymore in making those decisions with regard to college admissions. In the majority opinion in Students for Fair Admissions, Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, cited favorably the city of Richmond versus J.A. Croson case, which requires you to do detailed fact-finding as to whether or not there is either discrimination or the present effects of past discrimination. And he distinguished it from the diversity cases. And so there has not been any ruling that overturned Croson, which is the underlying case that we're dealing with here. The Croson case came out in 1989, and in that case, the city of Richmond had a goal for minority and women participation. And the court ruled, it was a case written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and there were several opinions, but the thrust of the opinion was that in order to have a program dealing with public contracts, state and local governments, it did not apply to the federal government, state and local governments had to have a strong basis in evidence. In other words, they made them apply what's called the strict scrutiny test. So you had to show 2 things. You had to show that there was a compelling governmental interest in remedying this problem, and you had to show that any means you used to address the problem was narrowly tailored specifically to address the problem. And so most governments that looked at that recognized that in order to do that, you had to do several things. You had to do a disparity study where you looked at the availability and the utilization of firms. You did some type of a regression analysis to control for capacity. That came out in subsequent lower court cases. And that you had to make some determination as to whether or not there was a legitimate legal basis for any type of preference or any type of goal-based program whatsoever. So once you cross that threshold, and we believe our study has crossed that threshold, then the question becomes, are the means you're using to address those disparities that you found narrowly tailored? That means specific to what you found, tailored to address the issues you found, and tailored to address the concerns you found in a way that doesn't overreach, that doesn't go beyond the remedy that you have to take. And so that's why in our recommendations, we're making a lot of race-neutral recommendations, things that don't implicate race at all, such as the Small Business Reserve Program, such as the outreach, the forecasting, the tracking, all those other things. But we're saying we also recommending that there be some goal setting, and that that goal setting be used as a benchmark to help you bootstrap into the question of whether or not there is discrimination on a contract-by-contract basis through a commercial non-discrimination program. So what we've done is kind of put together a set of recommendations that help you with the narrow tailoring prong of what the courts require. We think we've crossed the threshold, and we're prepared to stand by. Dr. Egan here has testified in several cases, including 6 cases, thank you, 6 cases, including the controlling case in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and been upheld with studies that did not have as much evidence as we feel we have here. So we're confident, we're putting our professional reputation on the line, that we believe that all the recommendations we're making, which are very carefully drawn and narrowly tailored recommendations, can be supported by the law. Now, of course, we're not unaware that what the court does today, it could do something different tomorrow. We're aware that they took a set of cases that have been in place for 30 years and overturned it with regard to the Students for Fair Admissions case. And where there are lower court cases that are proceeding related to the federal programs right now that are at the district court level. And so there could be changes in the law. But as the law stands today, we feel confident that we're foursquare within the bounds of what the courts have required and what the Supreme Court requires. And we feel somewhat emboldened by the fact that the Chief Justice wrote the opinion and cited favorably the case that we're seeking to fall in line with.
And again, I'm not prepared to argue on that point, but I will send, again, the case that I'm referencing to our legal staff and to Roger, and it was written on April 10th of 2024 this year.
I didn't get the part. You said you did what with your legal staff?
I will send my information to my legal staff because this article was written April 10th of 2024.
Okay.
And just a brief note, I know we did send that question to procurement. I'm not sure if our legal department was included on that, and I know there's been a response to that. Thank you, Director, if you can help address that. Thank you.
Well, actually, it was last year. I think that was the North Carolina case and the ruling there, and we sent that to legal. And but the decision was made to press forward with the disparity study.
Okay.
And the findings.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm actually not privy to a case as late as April. I'm just not.
Yeah. I know there was substantive response. I just can't recall. But yes, I think it's important that we do move forward confidently as a county to ensure that what we're doing is legally sound.
Yeah, and we're happy to assist in that.
Okay.
We did do after this case came out, we did do a 2-hour webinar about the case, and it was very clear it was only about college admission and not about public contracting. So I just wanted to correct that case was not about public contracting.
Okay, thank you.
And if I would add something as well. I will say that Griffin and Strong, we were very careful in selecting them. And one of the things I would like to commend them on is their disparity studies have never been challenged in court. And I think that's important. I think that speaks to the work that they do, the level of detail in arriving at data, analysis, and their findings. So I did want to just say that for the record.
Thank you, appreciate that. Commissioner, did you have any other questions? Okay, Commissioner Richardson?
Sure, just a little bit of commentary. For me, the bottom line is if there's a problem, got to define it, got to understand it. Disparity study is a part of that, so we can ask the right questions and understand what solutions are available. And if there is no problem, there is no problem. But obviously, there were some recommendations about some things which, as general commentary, I want to say I appreciate the range of recommendations. We've got 8 out of the 10 recommendations have no racial or gender bias. You've got 6 out of the 10 that have no preferential aspects at all, right? If you were to remove both the veterans and the small business, there's still 6 other recommendations that have potentially powerful systemic impacts to how bidding is done and how dollars do flow for some of these major projects. So I think, in recognition of a changing legal landscape, if we are to be thoughtful, there may be kind of a tiered approach that I would be interested in, that this board could take in looking at different implementations, because each of these can deliver quite a bit. The one thing I would say is benchmarking against each of these implementations, right? So success criteria and how you actually catalog whether or not you're making improvements. I think to some of my questions earlier around utilization and availability, making sure that definition is really robust, and that the success criteria, I would like to see something beyond availability, because we do know that sometimes benchmarking against availability can lead to other bad practices internal to an organization. And so kind of correcting for that and figuring out how to create those types of safeguards is really, really critical. I think there's an opportunity, I think Commissioner Burrow had brought up access and opportunity. That is, while not necessarily the main focus of this study, it is a critical component of these things, because availability might be, if all things are equal, you would see all things being equal, not just the awards, but also the population itself. So understanding opportunities for what those success criteria should be, so that we do correct for something that may be discriminatory in another capacity, I think is very important. So would like to see that, but I do just want to say I absolutely appreciate the 6 recommendations that are just as powerful as the other 4. And so I don't want that to be lost in the conversation about the legal things that we can't control at this point in time, the legal conversations that we cannot control at this point in time. But those are my general opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm kind of disappointed in the low turnout of response. I know that's not necessarily your fault, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And I know that I had received some comments from vendors who were concerned that maybe they've had contracts in the past or were the low bidder, and they see this coming out with the questionnaire, and were concerned that because they weren't minority-owned or women-owned or veteran-owned, that they would no longer be part of the contract award, which we told them that's not what this was doing, but, there was that perception out there. And I'm not sure how it was worded, the questionnaire and all, but that was some concern. In 2011, my first year in office, I came with a committee called Keep It in Cobb, of local business owners in the community, to kind of encourage businesses to stay local, for consumers to purchase local, but also businesses to do business with each other in Cobb and not go outside of Cobb for their services or products. From that, our purchasing director and agency director over purchasing at the time, we started the How to Do Business with Cobb seminars, and we still do those. We have one coming up October 17th. And that's a way for small businesses to get to know our departments that can make purchases under $2,000 without having to go out to bid or get 3 quotes. And they interact with the different department heads at these seminars to see what, they can order and what services they can provide. And they've been very well attended and very successful. From that, also in 2011, I brought forward the local vendor presence to change our purchasing ordinance to give additional points for Cobb-based businesses to help the small businesses. So when we started with this, my initial reaction was, why don't we do a local vendor preference for minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and the veteran-owned businesses? When we were tracking how many Cobb-based businesses were getting contracts, when I first started the program, 60% of DOT's contracts, our Cobb DOT, 60% were Cobb-based businesses. So to me, that's pretty good for keeping it local. I haven't gotten a report in a while, but why couldn't we track? I don't like to see things mandated. I like to see more incentives-based programs, and I think with this, we could do the same thing we did with the local businesses with implementing in our purchasing ordinance to provide additional points for, dollar amounts of contracts for minority and women-owned businesses and veteran-owned businesses. So I just like to see it done with incentives more than mandating that, that we have to do it.
So I might say that preference programs, as they relate to race and gender, have been frowned on by the courts, which is why we don't recommend, you can do them for veterans on a race and gender neutral basis, and you can do them for small businesses, but that's why we recommend it on the subcontracting side, because preference programs, we would not recommend doing a race or gender-based preference program just because it's frowned on by the courts.
For the
For
ordinance?
primes, for primes.
Hmm.
That's why we
Okay,
recommend.
well,
But you can do local. I mean, you can do local, but,
yeah,
and you already have a local.
and
the
veteran,
local
but not
And
minority
veterans,
owned?
but you cannot do based on race preference programs for primes.
Well, I know that Atlanta has had in place for, like you were saying, 30 or 40 years, that they have to use minority-owned businesses.
The city of
And-
Atlanta has a subcontracting program, and it's a goals-based subcontracting
okay.
program. So they don't have a preference, a minority preference program.
And then also, one of your
For primes, I'm sorry, let me make sure when I say minority preference program, for primes.
They do have the JV requirement
Yeah.
for 5 million.
Yeah, and that's considered race, gender neutral.
So, one of your recommendations, I know is already in place, you have to be an approved vendor to submit a bid. And at these How to Do Business with Cobb seminars, we actually walk them through how to register and be an approved vendor. Because if you aren't an approved vendor and aren't registered with the county, you won't get your invoice paid until you are. So I know that we do that at the seminars, and actually Stephanie Bryce has worked with individual small business owners one-on-one to walk them through the process. So our purchasing department is great. We're doing a good job, but I just thought we could do the local vendor like we do it for Cobb-based businesses.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Before I share a few comments, I just wanted to go back to the survey, a quick question. So on the survey, was there an opportunity to add additional comments, or was it just a series of questions
So we
on
did.
the survey?
Yeah, so the survey itself is fairly straightforward with you could there are places where it says other, and so you could fill in other, but there is a list of things that you can respond to. So it's a survey as opposed to, you know, a fill in the blanks kind of a questionnaire, which is why we also had focus groups, public hearings, one-on-one interviews, and we also accepted email comments and also did interviews with, oh, you're talking about the prime vendor survey, or you're talking about
Yes,
the
well,
questionnaire?
either survey, generally, even though it's a series of questions, there may be an opportunity towards the end to just add additional comments.
Oh, she's talking about the
And,
survey.
and if that was on the survey, I was just curious to know what the majority of those comments were.
Yeah, it left an other field on the questions that we asked.
Okay.
And then, of course, we had public hearings where we heard kind of freehand commentary from firms across the relevant market.
Oh, okay, all right. I just want to thank you all for the work that you've done with the study and the recommendations. I was particularly drawn to the joint venture idea. I think that's a fantastic idea. And also the small business reserve. And giving the businesses an opportunity, as you mentioned, to get to know each other as well and collaborate to take your business from, you know, that business that don't typically receive contracts to grow to a point where you can go from a subprime to a prime. I appreciate the study overall because it does give us insight into where those areas are that Cobb can focus on an opportunity to help build the businesses in Cobb County, particularly those that may feel disenfranchised from one way or another, for one reason or another, whether it's trouble with financing or whatever some of the survey results revealed. But I think we have here a basis for us to move in the right direction. And, you know, this study is not done with the intention of showcasing any weak spots within Cobb County, and I just don't want for anyone that's watching this to feel that there is a lack of confidence within our staff, because that's not it. This is just us simply having someone from the outside look in to share with us those areas that we need to make improvements. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I echo the sentiment of thanking you for all of the work that has gone into this for going on 2 years now. And I think when such intentionality is taken to dive into our processes, that means that there is a certain level of importance that has been exhibited in what the findings of that is and what the implementation and outcome of that can be. And so I'm hoping that we will be mindful of the opportunity that's before us. I think I'm hearing a conversation around a problem, but I think we should look at it as opportunity.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a problem if you look at economic success in our county as a zero-sum game. But if we can consider that Cobb County, we have the resourcefulness for everyone to do well, then we see what are the tools that can help us better help everyone to do well. And so I really want us to get out of, if somebody has help here, that means someone else is being hurt here. And I think that's an immediate drive to say, let's not consider race. But the reality is, if you look at data, there are racial inequities across many policy arenas. I serve on our Cobb and Douglas Public Health Board. We are able to better improve outcomes for minority women, particularly with the issues in our state due to maternal and infant deaths that have been occurring in the state, because we are intentional about seeing the racial disparity and knowing where we need to target. But that doesn't mean that we care any less about health for all of Cobb County citizens. And I would just consider the board to look at it differently. Imagine all of our citizens being better able to thrive with programs that are intentional about that. I think that looking at something as a future risk is important, but but that future risk of what is unknown and may not come to pass should not keep us from looking at the opportunities that are before us today. And so I appreciate all of the suggestions that you had. I did have some technical questions as you were presenting. I won't belabor time to ask you that. Those are some things that I can certainly ask offline, because to me, our understanding of that doesn't take away from my appreciation for the many recommendations that you have here. You can't really optimize an area well if you don't have data to understand where you are. So just the first recommendation of the contract numbers makes sense. Tracking subcontractors, incorporating contract numbers and fields is important. Just tabulating, who are we doing business with today? Because I don't know if, I think you shared that you didn't have all of that data, so making sure that we are getting that data and capturing it about our minority, women-owned, disabled veteran spend would just help us to be able to track if we're making improvements. If anybody has an issue being funded or with our current contracts, or if there's a complaint system in place, I think that could be utilized for any of our contracts. We want to make sure that anybody doing business on any of our projects is getting paid, and making that a more robust process, I think, would help anybody. A commercial non-discrimination policy, I think that would be consistent with our county's non-discrimination policy. I think we've talked a little about aspirational contract by contract goals. That's something I would need to probably understand a little bit more about how we get those numbers, because you said it's not necessarily a one-for-one. The small business reserve seems outstanding. I support Commissioner Sheffield's observation about the joint venture program. What a way, again, to increase opportunity for more. And we have a lot of opportunity coming up in our county as we are talking about the next SPLOST program already, even though we just implemented the 2022 SPLOST. Bundling contracts, I've heard that from small businesses. The contract financing, that's something I think that we could talk about with our banks that we have located right here in Cobb. That's a win-win for both of us. And the disabled veteran program, I think we could all get behind. I was surprised there are only 72 of them here in the county, but I think that that mission is well supported by our board. So I just want to thank you. I look forward to working with all of you so that these don't sit on a shelf. But even beyond these recommendations, I want to thank our procurement director for already meeting with our small business community, our minority business community, our women-owned businesses, our veteran-owned businesses, and letting them know about opportunities to learn more about procurement in the county, getting the database so that we even know what businesses are out there. And these are things that you did on your own because you saw the opportunity after hearing from businesses in our community. So I appreciate you being responsive, and I hope that we can support the work that you've already embarked on to ensure, again, everybody has a fair shot at contractual opportunities here in the county.
I do want to take this time just to say thank you to your staff. This was not a study that we kind of just did and then handed it in at the end. We had a constant dialogue back and forth and regular meetings with both Roger and with Stephanie. And so we greatly appreciate their contribution to the study and assisting us along the way. Particularly getting data is not an easy thing, and so they really helped us to pull the data that you had. And again, it was a constant conversation amongst our team and your team. So it really was a collaborative effort, and we want to thank your staff. We really appreciate them as well.
Thank you, Roger and Stephanie, for all of your work on top of everything that you do for us. One of the numbers I was looking for is how staffed are we compared to other procurement departments? You know, is it comparable considering the ratio of our staff?
Comparable, given the fact that you don't have an extensive remedial program. So, yeah, without having a lot of staff, you know, there are some places that have a lot of staff. They have a big program. There's some that have one. you know, so you're
It
better than that.
varies. We don't want just one.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. We truly appreciate your support. And of that of our county manager, who's no longer sitting here. She teleported. Hi, Jimmy. And thank you. I also see the agency director, Sharon Stanley, who's here. Appreciate your support. All right. Our meeting is adjourned. We'll be back at 7 p.m. for our general body meeting. Thank you.